Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing, the Thursday edition. I'm Brian Calley. I have the pleasure and privilege of leading the Small Business Association of Michigan, and playing the part of Sarah Miller today is Kelly Saunders. Kelly, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm the Executive Advisor and Director of Office of Administration here at SBAM. As Brian said, filling in for Sarah Miller, who will be back with us on Monday, of course. But want to give this opportunity to thank our sponsor, Consumers Credit Union. Make sure that you visit them at consumercu.org for your small business needs. So, Brian, we have quite a few things to talk about today, but let's start off with the monthly inflation numbers that were released this week. Were there any surprises?
Yeah, the inflation numbers this week came in pretty close to where analysts were expecting them, and I think probably close to where the Federal Reserve was assuming. So you might recall that we separate these, and when we talk about inflation, we talk about headline inflation as one part of it. The headline inflation is the overall number. It's everything in there, including commodities, things like gasoline and food that move up and down much more quickly than the core numbers. So the headline inflation was 4.9%, kind of like a milestone, you might say, that it was the first time in a long time that it had been below 5%, but pretty close to what it was last month. Remember, this is the year-over-year numbers where they compare this month with what it was a year earlier. And so it's kind of baked in or built in that it's going to be lower than it was at this time last year when it was hitting 40-year highs. The core inflation now for a few months in a row has been higher than the overall or headline inflation. The core inflation takes out those commodities, food and gas, and that came in at 5.5%. So again, that was a little bit. That's the part that's considered sticky and the part that's been a bit stubborn in coming down. So those were not really surprises. Those were the numbers that people expected. Now, if we look at the month-over-month numbers, so this is where we compare this month, just the inflation that occurred this month in the surveys compared to the month before, both were up 0.4%, and that's right around where analysts thought too. So it was an uneventful but predictable outcome, but the numbers are still uncomfortably high. So this is the target rate that the Federal Reserve is really going to keep on working until they get it to is more like 2%. I think they would become a lot less aggressive when it becomes 2 point something, even if it's closer to 3. But as long as you're in that 5% range, I think that that the monetary policies to continue to rein in inflation will be on the table. But I think they are content, since these are coming in as they expected, probably will leave things, they'll be more inspired to leave things in terms of interest rates where they're at least for a little while.
So kind of in that same vein, we've seen a divergence in recent months where goods inflation was trending down and service inflation was still going up. So has that dynamic changed at all?
Well, you still see service inflation a lot higher than goods, but there is it's actually showing just like a little bit of hope that might be changing. So if you were to separate out goods and services in that headline number, the goods are going up about 2.2%, so pretty close to what the target would be, and the services number was 6.8%. Now, if you were to look at it though, in terms of year over year, the goods inflation at 6.8% is actually slightly less. It looks like some hope there that maybe that is changing. The goods inflation was pretty flat, actually was up just a little bit, but kind of in that normal range. So it is really the services that have been the stickiest. It's more connected to labor costs and therefore moves slower. It would be the last thing that we'd expect to be impacted by the monetary policies to reduce inflation. But this was, I think, as I think back in the last 7 or 8 months, this was the first time that looking at the services number, there was any reason for hope at all that it had maybe topped out and maybe is ready to start coming down.
Anything else that stuck out?
Well, there's a few things that I would say are, generally good signs is that those things that people need, those commodities and the types of things that you can't live without, food at home, gasoline, even electricity, when compared to a year ago, they're all down. And so when you see that headline inflation lower than core inflation, it's because of those items are lower than before. And these are the same items that if you look at that net or real income growth, which still doesn't look great because it's nominal income growth minus inflation is real income growth. It actually looks a little better, and mainly because of those necessity type commodities. And again, it doesn't mean that the prices are low. It doesn't mean the prices have come down. What it means is that the increase as compared to a year ago is smaller, and so that I think is what's kind of working its way into these numbers, that those items have come down faster, and it really creates a situation where the kind of the last thing we're looking at here is the service inflation.
So switching topics, the federal public health emergency ends today. What, if anything, do we think will change?
Yeah, there's did our viewers even know that the federal public health emergency was still ongoing? I don't know if you did or not, but it ends today. It ends at midnight tonight, and there's a couple of things to watch. Now, what you'll see on the news is there's a part of immigration policy at the southern border that will change, and things could get very complicated on the southern border. So that'll probably dominate the news. But in terms of the COVID related things, it's things like free testing. So you might see some free tests still out in places where you can get at them, but that basically goes away. The Department of Health and Human Services and their networks have some supply, and I think theirs might continue on at least for another month or two. But the free testing is something that I think largely will go away because the public health emergency is the thing that required them to be free. Also, so like, if you were to have a COVID test done, it would be subject to whatever your insurance coverage was. And then with vaccines, kind of a similar thing, but I think with vaccines, you will see that that it's becoming more commonplace for vaccines to be covered in most insurance plans. I don't think that will probably change much. And then on top of that, the childhood vaccines tend to be just available public health departments and so forth. So some of the mandates go in the health care and health insurance system will be rolled back. But testing, I think free testing is the one that you'll notice the most, because the other things have kind of standard coverage or public health access even without this emergency declaration.
All right, let's switch and talk about infrastructure, roads specifically. There was a recent roads report which graded Michigan's roads, and it turns out that our grade level is still not good. So can we talk about roads as we have been for the past few years, and maybe more about that report and what's the plan for Michigan moving forward?
Yeah, so there's a lot of course, there had been a lot of talk about roads, been quiet on that front for a while. The federal government, the state borrowed some money for trunk line roads, I roads and M roads back in, it was authorized in 2019, and really 2021 and 2022 is when you saw a lot of the spend from that. The federal government also did some one-time influx of cash for that the state benefits from. So you did see a little bit of a bump, especially on the I roads and M roads because of those reasons. But as you mentioned, and we talked about this on Monday, the state was still graded quite poorly when it comes to roads. So what's the plan? Well, let's talk about the budget first. So the state's passing budgets this week. The MDOT budget does have, keep in mind, it's first House budgets and first Senate budget passed. They still have to be reconciled, and these aren't the final answers. But in the House Department of Transportation budget, there's there's the regular allocation for registration fees and gas taxes that goes through a formula in Public Act 51, and it distributes the money between county road commissions, cities and villages that have road departments, and then of course MDOT that manages the state system. So there's a formula where money goes into that formula from gas taxes and registration fees, and then goes out to those three types of road agencies. The legislature is also proposing to add some additional money on top of that, but not use the regular formulas for it. So there's a $400 million proposal that would allocate it based on population. And this is actually a pretty big change in policy. Now, it doesn't affect the regular road funding. They're saying they're going to put another $400 million into roads. And that's a little less than 10% of what would normally be spent. And the maybe 8% or so would be spent. And that money would be given to areas based on their population. And now, population and roads and infrastructure needs are not, they're actually not representative of traffic counts. I mean, people live in some places and work in other places. Some areas have major roads, but they're through roads. So the population in an area might have a lot of traffic through it, but people don't actually live there, or not as many people live there. So this idea of allocating roads according to population is a very, very different approach. And I expect that there'll be quite a reaction to that. Places where there are a lot of residences are going to be real happy with that. Places that have fewer residents but more traffic will come out behind. And then there's another $100 million proposal for like special projects. And these are the ones where, just for whatever reason, the legislature and individuals in the legislature identify that rather than just giving it to MDOT and giving it to county road commissions, that they're going to give it for specific projects. So you're going to use this money on that project, about $100 million proposed for that. So an increase, but distributed in a way that, well, the thing that's concerning about it is that each MDOT, county road commissions, and cities are required to do 5-year plans. And when they get more money and it goes through the regular formula, it funds the money in the 5-year plans. Those 5-year plans are subject to public hearings and notice to the public, and developed with a lot of public input. These other two approaches would be kind of done outside this extra money being put in is outside that 5-year plan and the funding formula that normally pays for it. So pretty big change. It's good to have money go into roads, and it's good for them to put a little bit of the surplus money into roads, but I think remains to be seen whether or not there are changes in the allocation or distribution of the money will be a net positive or not. I'm pretty concerned that it won't necessarily get to the places where the needs are the most, because it wouldn't be based on traffic, it'd be based on residential population.
So let's go back a little bit to what you had mentioned in that conversation on roads, which is to talk about the budget right now. As you mentioned, those first House and first Senate budgets have gone through, and they were all voted on along party lines. And so let's kind of take out the roads conversation and zero in on some other topics that are of interest to us. And let's just start out with, why were the votes along party lines?
Well, I think the simple answer is that the majority, so right now the legislature in the House and the Senate are, Democrats have very slim majorities, but they were confident that they could hold those majorities together, 56 in the House and 20 in the Senate, and really didn't need Republican support to get any of them passed, at least not on the first pass, not at this first round of budgets passing. And it is, I would say, it's kind of an unwritten rule of thumb that if you don't need the other side, you don't do anything. You don't engage with the other side as much. And so the budgets passed in basically exactly along party lines, and which means it hadn't even got to the point of real negotiation. Now, the negotiation in the future, I mean, yes, there's Republicans and Democrats involved, but keep in mind there's also a Senate and a House that have to reconcile differences. Their budgets do have some differences in them. And then they're actually quite different than the governor's original proposal as well. So you're gonna need to have negotiations that happen on a lot of different fronts. And I think it's kind of a foregone conclusion that, you know, if the minority party happens to be the Republicans at the moment, if they weren't really engaged in the construction of the budget, didn't have much input into it, then they vote no on it. The moving forward, whether or not when they come to a final compromise between the House and the Senate and the governor, if they need support, if they have maybe some of the legislative majority, the Democrats fall off, they need to get a couple of Republicans on board to make it happen. I think that's where you see the bipartisan, the possibility for a bipartisan vote go way up, is if the vote count requires it. At this point, they just didn't need them.
So let's talk about K-12 a little bit. They will definitely benefit from the state having extra money, specifically from our COVID years. And so what's new in that specific part of the budget?
Yeah, there's, so first of all, the K-12 budget is likely to be over $20 billion this year. So it'll reach an all-time high. And last year was an all-time high. And so a lot of this, you know, this excess money that has come in related to COVID, some from the federal government, inflation actually makes the sales tax revenue spike in the state. So most of that goes to schools as well. So there's some pretty big money. Both the House, Senate, and governor are proposing big increases or relatively large increases in the foundation allowance. That's the one, like, there's every kid on count day, you know, there's a certain amount the state pays the school for the actual student census, the population count within each school. So that foundation allowance will go up over, I think it's fairly likely to go above $10,000 in this budget. A few other things. There does seem to be a pretty big push for universal school lunch, and essentially free lunch for all students, regardless of income. Of course, lower income students and moderate income students already receive free lunch. But there's a school of thought that there's a stigma attached to it unless you do it for everybody. And so during the pandemic, there was free school lunch for everybody. I don't recall exactly why that was a pandemic related policy, but it was, and so there seems to be a renewed push to do that across the state. So that looks to me like it has support in all three branches will probably happen. And universal preschool is another big one, one that the governor's made a priority. And I think, and I say universal, but it's actually, I think they're looking to take the income limits at a point where it's nearly universal anyway. And so that would be, so the pretty big increase allocations that are likely to happen in Great Start Readiness, for example. And then the other thing is there are several what are called categoricals in the school aid fund, and this zeroes in on populations that have special characteristics, populations that have particular needs that go beyond a typical student. So it might be, in some cases, it's somebody who maybe English is a second language to them, so they're learning English while learning math and science and everything else. There's special education, kids with disabilities, and then kids that are in poverty, and those tend to be the most rural areas and the most urban areas that have high concentrations of poverty. There are certain categorical funding line items in the budget, and there are different proposals, different weightings, different approaches in each of the budget, but really all of those things, there's just more money in the school aid fund. The high inflation and extra COVID dollars have been a real windfall for the school aid fund. I think so it's a given that I think all of those things will go up. It should matter how much. I think the real big question is in future years when policymakers will probably want to try to sustain it. How difficult will that be?
All good points. Let's lastly, regarding the budget, talk about workforce development and higher education. Where do those topics fall?
So workforce development is pretty straightforward. There seems to be a fair amount of alignment, and that's in the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. Pretty good support, it seems like, across the board for workforce development, things like the Reconnect program, tuition-free community college for adult learners returning to school, for example, and also Going Pro, which is public-private partnership between private employers and trade schools and community colleges, a demand-based program. And so those, I think, they look pretty solid to me moving through the process. The universities will also receive an increase. Everything basically gets an increase this year because they are planning on spending all or most of the surplus, which is billions of dollars, about a $9 billion surplus. That is accumulated mainly from the COVID impacts. So on the universities, there is a difference in philosophy on funding. That the House is really looking to add what's called floor funding in for universities, to say that each universities, there's not like a formula, there's just a base that's always been, and then they do an increase to the base most years. And it's not really necessarily representative of any factor in any university. And so some schools receive way less per student than other universities. And so there's a school of thought of putting a floor in for that schools, based on how many people choose to go there, get a minimum. Michigan students go there, they get a minimum amount of state funding. So that's something, a difference between the House and the Senate. And also, what started I think it was about 10 years ago, was tuition restraints. So if you get an increase in funding from the state, you can only increase your tuition by a limited amount. And if you go over that, then there'd be a penalty in your state funding support. And the legislature does appear to be inclined to remove that. They might have a tuition restraint in there, but no penalty for violating it, which is the same as taking it out. So so they're in line for additional dollars. But if there is no penalty for tuition increases, then schools are dealing with rising costs as well. It'd be interesting to watch. Are schools more inclined to do bigger increases if the state no longer has a catch to the increased state funding to say, hey, you have the extra funding as long as you keep your increases in tuition at something below inflation?
Well, this is a great budget synopsis right now for us here in Michigan, and we're working hard here at SBM to make sure we're tracking all this information and keeping you up to date during budget season here in Michigan. So we'll make sure to continue to do that. But let's switch gears and talk about some federal policy. We've seen some bipartisan work at the federal level, specifically with the Michigan congressional delegation this week regarding H-2A visas. Can you talk about what those are, and how did Republicans and Democrats come together?
Yeah, and so in this case, it's the Republicans and Democrats in the Michigan delegation, except for one. There's a member of Congress in the Detroit area that didn't, Shri Tadnar, that didn't sign on to a letter taking a position on this particular type of visa. So these be for migrant workers in agriculture. And our state being a big agricultural state, workforce availability, especially for agricultural work, it's not available. And so there's a heavy reliance on this type of visa where people might spend from planting to harvest time, or in the harvest time in the country working on farms, moving across the harvest schedule of the whole country. But here in Michigan, very, very reliant on this type of visa. So there's been good bipartisan support of this visa, and the federal department that manages it, they had proposed a pretty steep increase. So they're looking at the cost of the application, and right now it's $460 per person. They're proposing to take it to $1,080 and $1,090 depending on whether it's H2A or H2B. And so H2A being in agriculture, H2B being the in the restaurant and hospitality business. So if you've been to Mackinac Island, for example, H2B visas, if we didn't have those, that the island couldn't run. And so that is an area where you saw Republicans, Democrats in the congressional delegation take a stand against that increase, fearing that it would make those types of visas out of reach for workers that are desperately needed for two of our three really big industries, tourism and agriculture.
Well, we love to see Republicans and Democrats coming together to get work done. So we'll continue to watch that as well. Let's move to our final topic for the day, which is a interesting convergence between op-eds in the news this week, both criticizing economic development and incentives for electric vehicles. Can you give us an update from those different perspectives?
You know, it really caught my attention because on the same day, in the Detroit News, there were op-ed pieces that were really going after electric vehicle incentive programs, but from both sides of the political spectrum. So you had somebody, a conservative economist, Patrick Anderson, and then Shawn Fain, the new president of the UAW. And we talked a little bit about Fain, the new UAW president, taking a pretty aggressive role in posture, both with the automakers and with the president of the United States, regarding all these incentives for the big companies, but feeling like workers are being left behind, or there's no strings attached for workers, and that there's a big transition happening. So there's a lot of, while there are more jobs being made for electric vehicle production, the combustible engine production, those jobs are at risk, and you see big decreases in the type of workforce that is needed today and will be needed on into the future. And so how do those workers get taken care of? So that was the perspective from the left side of the political spectrum. And from the conservative economist, Patrick Anderson, a piece that really looked at just the mechanics and the values, or the value of providing big incentives for this transition. And it's at a time where there's one side of the ledger that's counted, which is the new stuff that's happening, and again, kind of the same argument that on the other side of the ledger, where there's other things that are going away, that it's like looking at just half of the story without the other half. It stuck out to me because those are, I would imagine that those are two perspectives that don't often arrive at the same conclusion, and yet in this case did, and but for obviously very different reasons. And so what that tells me is that you put that together. One thing we didn't mention, I've talked about it before in this budget, that the House passed labor and economic opportunity budget. The governor asked for $500 or $600 million for the SOAR fund for economic development for these big projects and bigger companies, and the House nixed that. Not just cut it, not took it all out. And so that's I think that's kind of this left-right questioning of the just the size and the value, the scope, and the sustainability of that tool and the toolbox for economic development is maybe needs another look. So we'll watch it and see how it goes. I wouldn't be surprised if something still gets put back in that fund before this budget is finalized. But the fact that you have opposite ends of the political spectrum coming to the same conclusion, I think makes it harder than ever. I mean, harder than ever to put money in the fund, although you just never know where bipartisanship is going to show up in this system.
Well, it's definitely busy season here in Lansing, so lots to talk about today, and we want to thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned, Sarah will be back with Brian on Monday, but it's been a pleasure getting to be with you today. So thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you on Monday.